Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Helix WX wash processed Ecuador from Coffea Circulor. And there's the bag right there. And Coffea Circulor, based out of Gothenburg, Sweden. And this is the fourth and final part of our four-part series featuring Coffea Circulor's Nebula Constellation set. And of course, I saved the best for last, as this is definitely the coffee I was most interested in reviewing, and I definitely would have purchased an entire bag of this coffee on its own if it wasn't featured in that Constellation set, as this is yet another Mejorado from Coffea Circulor. And as of this moment, they do have one of, if not my favorite, Mejorado coffees that we reviewed earlier this year, which was the Mejorado from Cruz Loma. So when I saw them release another one, it immediately caught my interest, and given that it was in this set, it's the one I was holding off on reviewing until the very end. So I'm definitely looking forward to discussing this one the most, as this right here is day 38. And recipe we went with for this one was our Coffea Circulor recipe, or I should say Coffea Circulor's recipe, and a 15:1 water to coffee ratio. Brewed at 95 degrees Celsius, about 203 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, Coffea Circulor, definitely on the lighter side of things, as this coffee is another representation of that, as this one was definitely on par with the other coffees we've reviewed in this series, which is to say that it is on the very light side of things by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 18 first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and the coffee itself was a little bit more interesting than I might have expected for a Mejorado coffee, as it came out very herbal and cherry forward, with it being reminiscent of cherry soda with a lingering bit of sweetness to it. A slight complementary citric aspect was present in the cup as well, but the profile was very strong and straightforward, and given that it skewed a little bit more in that cherried sense, was something that I wasn't necessarily expecting from this coffee, even though it was one of the notes that they had listed on here. That's something we're going to discuss a lot more throughout this review. But let's move on to day 21, as we opted for the Chemex, and the cup has already increased in the overall sweetness, with much more of the sugary brown candy Mejorado-like attribute present throughout. The herbality remains one of the more intense aspects of this coffee, with some relatively soft citric brightness and even a slight bit of nuttiness. So I remember picking this up and saying that this is atypical of what I might expect from this coffee, and it's not something that was that present from this point going forward. But given that I was experiencing a little bit of it on this day, definitely wanted to chart and note that on this coffee. Let's move on to day 24, as we opted for the April brewer, and this was the most toned down the coffee had been up to this point, as the sweeter aspects were a little bit more herbal forward, so maybe not necessarily the level of sweetness that I was expecting or anticipating for this coffee. Outside of that, it did open up on the cool down with more of the sugariness and slight brown candied aspect, though this coffee in general felt a little bit more skewed on the herbal side of things, especially relative to the first couple of experiences. We move on to day 27, as we opted for the V60 with Coffea Circulor's recipe, and the coffee opened up tremendously on this day, as there was a very sugary cherry soda-like aspect to this cup. Sweetness at a very high level. Right off brew, there's a lingering brown candy sugariness throughout, especially in the finish. So right from the start all the way to the end, experiencing an abundance of sweeter aspects within this one. There's also a bit of the citric quality to the cup, especially as it does cool down, present both in the brightness and in the finish as well. Gives the cup some contrasting aspects to the very strong, sweeter qualities of this coffee. So it was definitely the best day I'd experienced up to this point. Day 30 through the Chemex with Coffea Circulor's recipe, and the cup just continues to improve, as it's another great day with nice consistency, as there's more of the tremendous sweetness in the Mejorado brown candy-like sense. Some softer citric aspects present yet again, as the cup continues to skew heavily on the cherry soda side of things, with a bit of the herbality and strong sugary sweetness. So at this point, no matter how I was brewing this coffee, with the exception of that April brewer day, this coffee just continues to open up and improve, and is enjoyable regardless of what sort of adjustments we make. Opted for the V60 with our final recipe of this coffee, and once again, Coffea Circulor's recipe, as it continues to offer tremendous sweetness, with listed toffee Mejorado brown candy-like aspects ever present, very strong, very pronounced, very defined within this coffee. More of the sugary cherry soda-like component, with a complementary herbality and softer citric component quality to it yet again. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. and one level 5, and this won't come as a surprise to anybody. It is the sweetness there at that level 5. And going into these coffees, I always wonder, are they actually going to score that level 5 in terms of the sweetness? Because there are some Mejorado coffees that we've reviewed that have scored at the level 4 mark. So it's not an automatic level 5. You don't necessarily expect that they will be tremendously or overly sweet coffees, but oftentimes they do turn out that way, and this one is no exception. This was an extremely sweet coffee. I want to say right from the start, as I noticed the sweetness, but all the way towards the end, it continued to open up and improve and just offered that very high level of sweetness throughout. So level 5, best place to put that for the sweetness, definitely coming in that traditional brown candy Mejorado-like sense. A bunch of level 4s. We'll start with the cleanliness level 4. And interestingly, the last review in this set we had was the Pillars WX. And I do have to say that I felt like the definition was a little bit better in this coffee. So I actually feel like this one was a little bit cleaner. Once again, this was a little bit cleaner of a Mejorado coffee. They're clean coffees in general, especially when they're wash processed coffees. But this one right here, I would say was maybe slightly higher than even some of the other Mejorados, as the definition to it was very nice, just very pronounced, just very well defined. Finish level 4. And I mentioned that it came in 2 directions, most specifically that lingering Mejorado brown candy-like sweetness, and in addition to that, a softer citric quality to it as well, a little bit more in that kind of lemon sense, so that gave it both contrasting characteristics to it, but also in herbality, so plenty to experience within the finish, giving it just some lingering depth to it. Florality, level 4. And I feel like that might be one of the more surprising aspects of this, because Mejorado coffees, yeah, at times they can score pretty high at that level 4 mark. I can recall at least a couple of them that have had maybe a little bit more of a hibiscus-like component. I'm even thinking of the original Pepe, but it's not always the case that the floral aspects do score as high as they did. And it's not something that we mentioned too much throughout the notes of this coffee, but while making this tasting one, I said there's a fair bit more florality within this coffee, so it does justify itself at that level 4 mark. Kind of surprising to me. We move on to the berry fruit there at that level 4 mark, and that of course is the listed cherry aspect to it. And going into it, I wondered just how prevalent that would be within this coffee, but given that it's just a little note listed on the bag itself, but very tremendously defined and pronounced throughout this coffee, I feel like it's interesting that it became one of the trademarks of what this coffee was. Caramel level 4. Mejorado brown candy-like sweetness. Don't think I need to discuss that too much more. It's always nice when I do see it listed as one of the notes on the bag for any Mejorado coffee, because it just makes me believe that the perception I've had of these coffees is in line with the roaster's vision or their experience with the coffee as well. So that was really nice seeing it on this bag and fully expecting it and then experiencing it yet again. Level 4, definitely the best place to put that. A couple of level 3s. We will start with the acidity level 3. Once again, interestingly, a little bit more brightness, but a couple of things, Coffea Circulor as well as Mejorado don't necessarily tend to offer the most amount of brightness. So I don't think it's too surprising that it finished there at that level 3 mark, though at times I felt like there was maybe a little bit more to it. Citrus level 3, it's that softer lemon-like aspect that I mentioned, and it just kind of gives the coffee, I would say, a little bit more of a refreshing depth, given that it does have that soda-like experience to it to begin with. When you kind of contrast that with a slight bit of lemon, then just kind of think of it as maybe like squeezing a little bit of a lemon into a soda. So fun little attribute within this coffee. And then final thing worth discussing, interestingly, is the body at a level 3. And given that I've been discussing that with each and every one of these coffees, it was surprising to me that this one is the one that had the most amount of texture and body to all of the Coffea Circulor coffees in this set, in this review series, because it wasn't my expectation for a Mejorado coffee to be that way. Honestly, probably that Kenyan coffee is the one I might have expected to have the most amount of body. Once again, making these tasting wheels side by side, I found that this one had the most amount of texture to it. So that's a little interesting layer to this one. But as I am looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. First thing I wanted to say is it's not necessarily the most unique of the Mejorado coffees, because it does remind me of the Nueva Esperanza that we'd reviewed from Subtext, which also seems to offer a very sugary, caramelized, sweet cherry soda-like attribute to it. But I do have to say that I enjoyed this one a little bit more than I enjoyed that one. And It's interesting to kind of figure out between this one and the Mejorado WX, the one from Galo Morales, which of these Mejorado coffees I enjoyed a little bit more, because that one was my favorite one up to this point, but I felt like it was held back ever so slightly, but what felt like a little bit more of a slight roasty quality to it, whereas this one right here, I found the profile to be a little bit prettier and more beautiful to it, and in addition to that, it did offer, I would say, just better definition to an outside aspect of the Mejorado. So it still had the very strong sweetness, that very strong candy, like brown candy aspect to it, but in addition to that, a very pronounced cherry soda like component to it. So for that reason, I feel like I probably enjoyed this one slightly more, even though that one offered a little bit more of that berry and kind of peachiness to it. I think I'm just really comparing these two coffees side by side, and it's really hard to think about, but maybe brewing these coffees and trying them side by side to determine which of the two I did enjoy more, given that it's very, very close. But that's all to say, this one was my favorite of the set. I regret that this is only a 100 gram bag of this coffee, because I would have loved reviewing a full 250 grams of this one and having a little bit more frozen, because I think that this one was a very nice coffee and definitely a continued representation of how good Coffea Circulor can be. The type of person I would suggest this coffee to. Funny enough, I've actually already suggested this coffee to a number of people, but if you've enjoyed that Nueva Esperanza from Subtext, or if you enjoy any of the Mejorado coffees, then this has all of the classic attributes to it. Great clarity, tremendous sweetness, plenty of that brown candy-like aspect to it, and then couple that with a very well-defined cherry soda-like attribute as well, and you get a number of different things within this one, as this one has a little bit more depth than the average Mejorado. Oftentimes I've felt like there may be a little bit to one note, but that one note I enjoy so much. Tremendous brown candied sweetness to them in a very clean sense. This one has all of those things with a complementary cherry herbality to it. And given that I've never been the biggest fan of cherry in coffee, most of these it comes out in a little bit more heavy or fermenty of a sense. This one right here is clean. I don't have any grievances with it whatsoever, as it's very much represented within the coffee itself being on the cleaner side of things. So very enjoyable experience. Best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and best way I can leave this review. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd definitely love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Helix WX wash processed Ecuador from Coffea Circulor. Thank you for watching.